Have you heard the phrase, the only thing that is constant is change? Well, that statement is true for a country's economic activity over time. Fluctuations in a nation's rate of economic growth are called the business cycle. A typical business cycle has 4 periods: an expansion, a peak, a contraction, and a trough. During an expansion, the economy's output and employment both increase. Companies hire more workers to produce the additional goods and services that consumers and businesses demand. When economic activity reaches its peak, output and employment have reached a temporary maximum. The economy is at the top of the business cycle. Eventually, economic growth slows down as the economy slips into a period of contraction. In this phase of the business cycle, output and employment tend to decrease. As companies see a fall in the demand for their products, they'll lay off some workers and reduce production. If the contraction becomes severe, the economy can slip into a recession. Generally, economists define a recession as 6 consecutive months of declining output. For example, from late 2007 to the middle of 2009, the United States experienced a serious economic downturn, dubbed the Great Recession. The unemployment rate soared to 10% of the labor force during this period, which is significantly higher than what economists consider acceptable. And in the 1930s, most of the world suffered through a decade of very weak economic activity called the Great Depression. In the United States, the unemployment rate shot up to a staggering 25% of the labor force, and national output plummeted. Many companies went out of business. Although recessions can have lingering effects, they don't last forever. In the same way that what goes up must come down, what hits bottom eventually climbs back up. After an economy reaches its lowest level of the business cycle, called a trough, a period of expansion or recovery begins, and the business cycle continues to revolve. So, what factors affect the different phases of the business cycle? One factor, called fiscal policy, refers to changes in government actions regarding spending and taxation. For example, to combat rising unemployment during a contraction period, the government can stimulate employment 2 ways. It can increase its own purchases of goods and services. To produce these extra goods and services, companies will need to hire more workers. The government can also reduce taxes on households and businesses, increasing their demand as well. Likewise, if the economy is expanding so fast that prices are surging upward, a period of rising inflation, the government can use fiscal policy to reduce its spending on goods and services and increase taxes, which will dampen demand. Another factor affecting the business cycle involves changing the country's money supply. Monetary policy is carried out by a nation's central bank. In the United States, this bank is called the Federal Reserve. By pumping more money into the economy during a contraction, the Federal Reserve attempts to stimulate the demand for goods and services, which increases employment. On the other hand, if there is a threat of rapidly increasing prices or rising inflation, the Federal Reserve can reduce the money supply to slow down demand. Consumer and producer confidence in the economy also affect the business cycle. When consumers sense the economy might slow down in coming months, they worry about losing their jobs. And when they're concerned about losing income, consumers tend to postpone purchases of houses, cars, and other items. To offset the expected loss in profits, businesses then trim back production and reduce the number of employees they hire. And when businesses feel the economy is headed into an expansion period, they can increase their purchases of new factories and equipment. This increased capital investment by businesses stimulates output and employment. Because the economies of countries are interrelated, the business cycle of one country can be affected by events in other countries. Consider this. If another country is experiencing an expansion phase, its citizens and businesses may buy more American goods and services. The increased demand helps to stimulate U.S. employment and output. But if a country's government increases a tax on goods another country sells to its citizens, known as a tariff, those 2 countries may end up trading less, which could increase the rate of unemployment. Technological change can also affect the rate of economic activity. For instance, breakthroughs in software and automation can make companies more efficient, but they also can result in displacement of some workers who don't have the skills to operate in the new business environment. When individuals, businesses, and countries recognize the economic impact of business cycles, they're better able to adjust to economic ups and downs and take steps to encourage periods of expansion and minimize periods of contraction.